Welcome to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, where we'll be serving up bite-sized conversations on all things fitness, nutrition, mindset, and spirituality. So grab your headphones and get ready to taste the truth with us every Tuesday. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform because every bite counts. Hey, welcome back to Taste of Truth Tuesday, everybody. This week's episode, Detransition, Lawsuits and Accountability, a deep dive with Transition Justice, which is a nonprofit, is an episode that follows up to a previous one that was on this season, episode 8, From Women to AFAB, The Origins of Gender Ideology and Its Political and Scientific Implications. So if you've yet to listen to that, I suggest going back and listening to that one, but you don't have to in order to appreciate this interview. So today we're sitting down with Martha, one of the co-founders of Transition Justice, which is an organization dedicated to helping detransitioners and their families seek legal recourse. Because what happens when people realize they weren't given the full picture before making life-altering medical decisions? In the episode, we discuss the legal patterns emerging in gender medicine cases, the tension between bodily autonomy and medical ethics, the social and ideological forces influencing these transitions, especially in progressive areas like Portland, Oregon, how parents can navigate the pressure to affirm without question, and what legal and cultural shifts might be on the horizon. So as someone who has spent years in Portland, Oregon, I've seen friends get swept up in this ideology and some even transitioning their kids. Now, many are questioning what they've been told. This conversation is about accountability, informed consent, and the fight for justice. Martha, thank you so much for joining me. I'm so very grateful. And I just love if you'd like to just kick it off, starting with the big picture, introducing yourself and what led you to co-found Transition Justice. And what are you seeing in the cases that are coming to you right now?
Yes, well, Transition Justice is actually a project of Partners for Ethical Care. And Partners for Ethical Care is a non-profit that's secular, nonpartisan. We formed about 8 founders, about almost 5 years ago now, when we saw the gender industry just proliferating and taking advantage of a lot of children and young adults. So a lot of us came from different professional backgrounds in different parts of the world and started really looking at this issue and then trying to figure out, how is this happening across the world in every developed country? So that's kind of what we did in 2020. And then what we really wanted to do, since I'm a lawyer, I have wanted to help detransitioners and people who were victimized by the gender industry, because I knew they were being preyed upon and that these treatments were not necessary at all, and that people grow out of gender dysphoria all the time. Historically, they did. So we decided, we need to find lawyers for these people, and it took a while. But finally, in 2022, we started seeing a few people who would take cases. In 2023, we found a firm here in Dallas that all they do is take cases for detransitioners and parents whose children are now deceased from all this. So that's really what the Transition Justice Project is. And it's now 3 years old.
That's amazing. And thank you for clarifying about the PEC and just the overall umbrella name that Transition Justice is included in. When it came to beginning to use your experience as a lawyer and to advocate, like you were saying, it was difficult in the beginning to find lawyers or law firms that would take on this case. And we've talked about this on the podcast before, how this ideology has become, you cannot dissent from it. It has this extreme consequences professionally, socially. It's almost like the new form of McCarthyism, as has been spoken by many researchers. And so what were you seeing in those cases then that kept you motivated to push back against such strong resistance? Because I know that had to be very difficult.
Oh, yeah. What we were seeing was just untold collateral damage from these treatments. So every kid we talked to, their story was worse than the one before. And I mean, almost every time. And I'm not a crier, but almost every time I get on the phone with these people, I get a little teary-eyed, and they do too. And anybody else who's on the call, it's really, really hard because these were people who were usually very young. Well, we have a few who were in their 30s and 40s, but in those cases too, they were very vulnerable. I talked to the mother of a man who was about 30, in his late 30s when he started this, and he's blind. And doctors convinced him that he needed to have facial feminization surgery, even though he can't see his face. I mean, that's how bad it is. And this poor mother, having to deal with her blind son going and getting surgery on his face. And, she was scared to death. Could he take care of himself after this? I mean, it didn't make any sense. And so you have people, in those age ranges, but most are the very young. And that means children whose parents are transitioning them from tiny little, 2 and 3 years old, to a big group of kids who are sucked in around puberty. So 12, 13, 14-year-old girls and some boys. But that we saw just a huge amount of girls in that age group. Why? Because all girls hate puberty, all boys hate puberty. But girls do this in groups more. So they were able to influence each other. Yet, friends at school, you'd have teachers who were encouraging it. So it's so insidious, and it leaves these kids with just irreversible damage. So I can't not do it. And that's how all of us at Partners for Ethical Care feel that way. We can't not do it.
I can imagine the amount of weight and fire. That's like this collaboration to keep you going, no matter how tired or overwhelmed and burdened you feel with all the other responsibilities you have to juggle in life. And so I hope you know that there's many of us who don't have the expertise like you do, but I am speaking out and taking some of those social consequences. And I'm willing to do that. So we're part of the same army, and I'm honored to meet you and to chat with you.
Thank you.
And, are there common threads of vulnerabilities that you see in these stories, like with particularly maybe just focus on those young girls, like we said? Of course, we mentioned we don't like how going through puberty, it's very uncomfortable when you start to get the breast development. But was there anything else that you saw, perhaps like TikTok or something?
Absolutely. So the vulnerabilities that are the common threads are about half the kids are on the autism spectrum. So that is a big, big one. And then I would say of the kids who are not, the vast majority had some kind of trauma. So they have PTSD. It doesn't mean necessarily they were sexually abused, although that can be a biggie. But it's people who, they maybe lost a parent, or they lost a close friend, a death. Something horrible happened to them, and they were trying to console themselves, just with the computer as kids, or their phone as kids are wont to do nowadays. And yes, then the next vulnerability is social media and any kind of online, anything online that you can find. So you have some kids who are super intellectual, and they're searching, they're doing research online, and they may not even get into the social media games, but they may get into video games or some other kind of online activity, and it's in everything. So even you have video games that convince children and young adults that if you like this character and you're a boy, but this character is a girl, Zelda is a really popular one. A lot of boys will say, I knew I was transgender because I related to Zelda. I mean, that's how bad it is they're telling these kids, oh, you relate to Zelda and you're a boy. No, you must be transgender then. And when you're really impressionable, when you're autistic, when you're going through trauma or grief of some kind, it can come to get you, just like any kind of cult.
Yep, absolutely. And, I've also spoken about social media and the radicalization that can happen amongst that, whether that's going to be political or just in general, that's more ideological mind viruses, and how the algorithm supports that and can just keep fueling that victimhood narrative that has just come from the colleges and has spread all through society.
Oh, yeah.
And, I am an elder millennial, graduated in 2004 from college. So I was just beginning to get it, but it wasn't as bad as even my sister, who came out 4 years younger than me. Just 4-year difference was a lot. And so, it almost makes me want to cry because of just seeing how, I've mentioned to you on our call prior to recording, being in the fitness industry, there is a ton of pressure about how we look and not liking our bodies, and a ton of manipulation and exploitation on women, but men as well, about how to look a particular way. And I've advocated always against augmenting your body to meet those standards, because typically it's always just a moving goalpost.
Oh, exactly.
And so I'm just so sad to see how that has now been radicalized against one of the most vulnerable population, which is children.
Yeah.
And before we transition, because I really want to talk more to the navigation of the tension between autonomy and medical ethics. Is there anything you want to add about that one part, but kind of before we shift gears a little bit?
About the underlying, the trends and things like that.
And how to push, how to speak to those who are indoctrinated into this cult.
And that's one of the hardest things, Megan, is that even if you have, first of all, everybody has heard by now that this generation of kids is not critical thinking, right. And I think that's probably truer than it used to be. But I will say that I have seen kids who are super critical thinkers on every other aspect except this, and they still get sucked in. So since I work with so many detransitioners, I will tell you, these are just amazing kids. They are some of the smartest, and that's another underlying vulnerability, is high IQ. So you have some of the smartest people you could ever meet, charming, fun. Some of them are introverted, a little shy, but once you get them talking, they're really great. And you just go, how did you ever fall into this? And they'll tell you, people tried to talk me out of it and I wouldn't listen. My parents didn't want me to do this. They said there was nothing you could do to convince me that I was wrong at that time, because I was so indoctrinated. And that is one of the biggest challenges, is how do you reach these kids who are sucked in? It's virtually impossible. Some people have said they changed once their politics changed, that they finally started seeing that the whole thing was a ruse, all the DEI and all that. But I've still seen so many kids who still are they admit that DEI and everything is, the whole woke agenda is a misleading and false and, predatory in some ways, but they don't see that they are a victim themselves.
Yeah. And I feel like maybe that's one part of the deconstruction, because it is very difficult, as someone who has been in multiple cults before.
Yeah.
For that realization to settle in. There's cognitive dissonance, there's denial, there's a lot of that. Yeah. And that's part of the journey as well. It's a safety mechanism almost in a way. But, I hope that we are on the cultural shift. I feel more courageous with these orders coming through.
Yeah.
I said in the podcast that dropped out about AFAB, assigned females at birth, this is something people have been yelling at me to not say women for 5 years at least, but I haven't had the courage to speak out until now, which is why I just really commend you and your partners for being ahead of the curve of this, cultural shift, which is why I wanted to talk to you, because I'm fired up about it. And so, to shift gears, because I do believe in body autonomy, which is an interesting subject as someone who has major regrets for abortions, but that is a totally different topic for another day. But I am part of the medical freedom community.
Yes, me too.
You spoke of, in one of the stories you said earlier about the blind man getting facial reconstruction surgery. And that seems like a violation of medical ethics. And that's what I want to talk to you about in regards to how do you, as, you're as a lawyer in this organization you work with, how do you navigate this, the bodily autonomy, concerns about medical ethics and gender medicine? And where do you see that line? Is there a line between informed consent and medical negligence, or is the whole thing this is what I'm most excited to hear from you about?
Well, this is beyond negligence. That's the thing. it's not negligent. This is intentional disfigurement and sterilization of young and vulnerable people. So what I like to say, because we have a lot of conservative legislators, who will say, well, we don't want to stop adults from doing what they want to do, because they should have the right to do that what they want with their own body. Which is funny, because I'm like, well, yeah, but we do regulate abortion, right? So I don't really get how they. And then they go, well, yeah, and they say, but that's because there's another person there. And I'm like, yeah, okay, that's true. But you also regulate other medical treatments all the time. For example, we have opioid overdoses, fentanyl. We don't allow doctors to just prescribe fentanyl on demand. Why would we do that? We don't allow doctors doctors stopped doing lobotomies, because these are so harmful that it's wrong, and you can't get away with that. Somebody will take you to court. And somehow with this gender medicine stuff, nobody was taking these cases. Nobody was taking these people to court. And the legislators, until we really pushed hard, in the red states, they finally started listening, but it took a while. And some still will say, well, yeah, but what about adults? And I said, well, do adults have the right to be abused? I mean, if you're a female and your husband is beating you, does that mean, well, she puts up with it, so we're not going to say anything? No, the police still need to arrest a man who is beating his wife. Just because she is okay with it doesn't mean it's okay for society. So, and even worse in this case, because I'm probably in those cases too, but absolutely in these cases, the fact that you're asking for important body parts to be destroyed or disfigured should be a red flag that there's something wrong with you. So this is absolutely not within medical records. It is not within the Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg Code says you can't experiment on human beings without full disclosure, without there being an overall benefit to the treatment. There's all kinds of requirements in there that are necessary for experimentation on humans to be present. I don't think with the COVID vaccine they were present, and I definitely don't think they're present in this case, because what is the benefit? That you have a lot of people without their body parts running around? How is that a benefit to society?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think one thing that I've spoken to that you were touching on is consent-based morality. Mm-hmm. So, if a woman is consenting to getting beat, then that should be okay. I speak to that in my experience about being a sex worker, because I consented to that. And young girls, young children might consent to sexual activity, but does that make it okay? Exactly. So this is definitely the slippery slope. Yeah. And so I appreciate that. And, just saying that, this isn't negligence. There is so much information, especially just understanding where it comes from. John Money and his failed experience, the fact that it's based on pedophilia, it was part of my deconstruction. I didn't just deconstruct from a fundamentalist religion. I deconstructed from so many, there's dogma in so many fields.
You're so right about that. You're so right.
And that holds us back in general. Scientific inquiry was not meant to, hold us back. And so that is the saddest part, to see these institutions completely radicalized, like ACLU and other organizations. And we're seeing a lot of that come through with the USAID, coming out. And that is just really fascinating, how this is just absolutely social engineering without a doubt. And that's just becoming more and more clear. And so, we already touched on the role of social and ideological influences that are playing a rise in gender transitions. And I will link some researchers who have expanded a little bit more on this for you guys who might be curious on that. But the next question I wanted to touch on is speaking to parents who, we kind of touched on this, like you can't really speak to the folks who might be rooted deeply in this ideological framework, which is why it's a big red flag of a cult. Yeah. Yet, there are parents, I believe, like you said, that are just afraid to speak up. I think there's medical professionals that, even with the vaccine schedule, are afraid to speak up, but they're excited with this momentum of RFKJ. Love him or hate him. Is he a wolf in sheep's clothing? No one knows. But I think the more education that's coming out of advocacy and informed consent, which is the ability to say yes or no, is really important. So for, parents in progressive areas, like where I lived in Portland, Oregon, they are feeling this immense pressure to affirm their child's identity without question. And I think that's somewhat okay. Like if their little boy wants to paint their nails, if their little boy wants to play with something that's more of a girl-like toy,
that's totally,
so where's this line, right? And what would you say to parents who are very unsure and fear of being labeled as bigots, but are feeling courageous enough? Like, what would you say? Maybe contact your organization. Like, what would you give them for encouragement?
Yeah, so there's a lot of organizations out there who are helping with especially the social transition part. So absolutely, you can contact us. There's groups like there's Moms for Liberty. There's like Protect Kids California. There's most states have a group that is like set up to protect kids from early sexualization and things like that. And I would say if you have a little boy or girl who is gender nonconforming or wants to do something that the other sex does, that's fine. Let them do what they want, just as long as they know that that doesn't change who they are. Your little boy can wear a ballet costume and paint his nails all he wants. And I wouldn't try to stop any of that. What I would say is, that's cute. You're a cute little boy in a tutu. I mean, that's all. You are a boy. It doesn't matter what you do, no matter what anybody else tells you. You can't change biology, and you shouldn't. And we love you the way you are. That's what I would tell parents. And I feel so bad for the parents in those areas, but I will tell you that for many people, if your child is at risk, you may be better off just moving, because that's what one of our founders had to do. She had to leave the state of Washington because, that they have a law now and we have filed a lawsuit in Washington. In fact, I actually have to review the latest pleadings on that. So I'm glad we talked about it. But in that lawsuit, we're saying the newest legislation passed in Washington was that if a child runs away from home for gender affirming care or for reproductive, you don't have to tell the parents where they are. So the state can take charge of your children. And that is the scariest thing in the world to a parent whose child has flirted with or been, recruited into the gender cult stuff. And sometimes they're very young kids. And somebody is telling them, oh, you like that? You must be a boy. And so those parents are saying, oh my God, I could lose custody of my child because somebody, and one of the people we know, one of the kids' friends called the police on her because she said she's abusing her child. She's not affirming her.
Oh my goodness.
So the police actually showed up at her house, and in her case, she was lucky because they were sensible policemen who said, they're not doing anything wrong. But by law in those states, you can take somebody's child if you feel they're in danger, which in danger in some of these states just means you'll be offended, because you use the wrong pronouns.
Right. Yeah. The coddling of the American mind. And the psychological safe space, which is alarming indeed. Yeah. So, on that note, I didn't prep you for this question, but what we're seeing in regards to specific states fighting back, we have these, like New York saying they're a sanctuary state for transgendered kids. I think we saw that with
Minnesota, California.
Tim Walz's state, which made me so concerned.
Oh my God.
Whenever him, mentioned he also bribed kids with the vaccine, which is coercion. I just had so many red flags, and all my friends.
He was creepy, honestly.
My friends were
groomer vibes,
so groomer vibes, and I get Trump is not an ideal person, and they just have Trump derangement syndrome so hardcore that they couldn't. They were like overriding their intuition. So anyways, so what would you have to like? Can you explain a little bit more for our listeners about what's going on with those sanctuary states? Because there's this balance of states and federal government. Like, can you explain a little bit?
Sure. So the red states, of course, practically every one of them passed a law the last few years to stop all these treatments. And groups like mine, where they're bringing detransitioners and testifying in favor of these bills, they don't go near far enough. But at least they're stopping it for children who are 18 and younger. And then the blue states, in response, went and proposed these sanctuary state laws. So now you can take a child, and they're dangerous for everybody. So this is what the parents in California and Minnesota and those other blue states want everybody to know is it's not affecting just our kids, it's affecting your kids everywhere in the country. Because like we had, for example, Jeff Younger here in Texas, who his little boy was being trans by the mother. They got a divorce. She was a pediatrician, so the court thought, she knew what she was doing and allowed her to do whatever she wanted with the little boy. So in Texas, we passed a law to stop that. And her son was only like 11 years old, so he couldn't get gender affirming care here anymore. Well, so what does she do but move to California with the child? And California laws say, oh, too bad, Texas can't do anything to her or to the doctors that are trying to put a puberty blocker in his arm. So, and speaking of which, Jeff Younger, the dad, said, speaking of Trump, and I don't want to be political, but he said, Trump did this for me and people like my child. He passed an executive order saying no federal funds to these places that are transing children because his son was going to, I think he was at UCLA Children's, and that they stopped doing it because they received federal funds. So what Trump did literally could have saved that child from a horror of, because you know what would have happened with the little boy getting a puberty blocker in his arm? They don't develop their sexual parts. So these little boys grow up with a micropenis. And it also can change the way their brain works. It absolutely changes the way their brain works to the effect that if you give a child puberty blockers, the doctors will represent to you, oh, it's reversible. It just helps them, bide some time while they think about it. But 98% of kids who get one go on to take cross-sex hormones. So it prevents their brain from doing what it would do naturally, where they would grow out of this confusion. Once they get through puberty, they're in their later teens or so, most of them are happy with their body or they're more comfortable. They want to go out with people of the opposite sex, or maybe the same sex if that's their attraction, but they don't want to undergo these things. But when they're young and they have a child's brain, they think they have magical thinking. They think you can all of a sudden change your sex, and you can't. And speaking of magical thinking, it's not restricted to children in any way. It is, these young adults too are completely indoctrinated, like you have said, and they really believe it's going to be magic. All of a sudden, they are going to look like a boy is going to look like a beautiful girl, and vice versa.
I actually have, I speak about magical thinking. I was just scrolling back but we speak about that in regards to multi-level marketing and how they exploit magical thinking. I was a part of the law of attraction, which is like, name it and claim it. There's even versions of Christianity that say in the name of Jesus, and then they claim it. So there's a lot of similarity in mindsets here. So magical thinking says, like, if you want it badly enough, just believe in yourself and the universe will reward you. It's just this carrot dangling in front of you that's just absolutely exploitative and manipulative and heartbreaking. And so I appreciate you, expanding on a little bit more about what these, state by states are happening. And, when it comes to Trump, I have seen folks who just are, they don't have TDS, they don't have Trump derangement syndrome. They're not a fan of him. And they're mad that they're like, how is he advocating for something that I agree with? So I feel like anyone who's listening is probably could potentially be on either side of the spectrum, because most of the country agree with not only just limiting and protecting children from this, but also, saving women's sports and getting, biological men out of these sports. And that's something that I've been very passionate about as well. So to close down the conversation, because I know you're very, very busy, and I just couldn't be more grateful for your time and your expertise. And I'm sure the listeners have learned a lot. The last question I have is, what legal and cultural shifts do you foresee? I mean, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but in the next, couple 3 to 5 years regarding gender medicine and detransitioners?
Oh, wow. Well, what we're asking for now, we're asking the states, and we're going to ask the federal government to provide some kind of compensation for detransitioners for all their injuries, to help with their mental health, and to extend the statutes of limitation so that they can sue the provider. Because in most states, after 2 years, you can't do much with medical malpractice. 2 years is nothing, even for a regular case. But the reason those laws are in place is because most doctors are trying to do the right thing and help people. And if they make a mistake, most of the time, it should be discoverable within 2 years. If it's something inside your body that was wrong, usually they will, some states, not all, Texas and most states provide a discovery period of time for that. But a lot of states have not applied that to gender affirming care. So these kids, even though they were on the autism spectrum, had bipolar disorder, all these different things, when they went and got this medicine, 2 years later, they're told it's too late, even though it might have taken them years to mature. Because autistic kids with ADHD, and these are hugely represented in this population, they don't mature at the same rate as other kids. So it may take them till their mid-30s to go, oh my gosh, or to try to, when they actually get involved with someone and they can't have sex. I mean, what are you going to do at that point? It's heartbreaking, because everybody has the right to a healthy sexual function, right? I mean, in my opinion,
yeah,
that's a human right, is to reproduce and, be able to be married and
have pleasure.
Yes, exactly. And these kids are closed out from that.
And they don't even know, I mean, even going
no.
back to my experience as a sex worker in Portland, Oregon, it's taught, where it's empowered, it's, it's real work, whatever. And no one clued me in at all on how this would potentially impact me and my husband down the road.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Sex workers are not in committed relationships because figure that one out.
Yeah.
It's pretty easy to see most men don't want to be committed to someone who is working in that industry.
Exactly.
So I don't know. It shakes out to being there's all ideas have consequences. There are serious consequences with these ideas, and informed consent includes being presented with all information. And that's the biggest beef I think a lot of us have with these, the puberty blockers. They say it's reversible. That's not correct. Informed consent. That is almost, manipulation. I appreciate your time. And and clarifying about what you want to see, maybe not what trends that we can see, but what you're clarifying and the work that you're doing and what you're asking from federal and state levels. And I do think that extending that statute of
limitations. Yeah.
Thank you that's why I have you here. Well, it sounds very wise. I think that this whole cult of expertise, this worshiping of doctors, the CDC, it's very strong in folks who have recently graduated because of what's happening on the college campuses. They really love the expertise that they get and they worship it almost. And I do think that credentials are very important, but I don't think it just says, it doesn't prove education at this point anymore. And I think folks who don't go to college can also be very intelligent and educated. So It's very interesting to see how academia is shaking out into all different forms, from social media into the schools. Is there anything you'd like to add to close the conversation down before I let you go?
Oh, I would just add that, I do think we're on the cusp of finally getting some media. I mean, that's been the hardest thing, is getting mainstream media to even cover this issue. That's one of the best things that I think Trump has done, is bring it to the forefront, because just by laying it out there, even without having laws underneath the executive orders to carry them out, it's saying, look, this is a problem and nobody's talking about it. So if you don't like it, come out and say something. Come out. And what I think we need to have is public hearings where we ask these doctors, why did you think it was okay to have this little boy grow up with a micro penis? Why was that all right for you? Why was it okay to cut off a little girl's breast when she was, 17 years old?
Yeah.
And we need to see them up in front of everybody with cameras rolling.
And explain for themselves. I heard a story that a young girl who was trying to transition to biological male, which we all know is impossible, but her doctor told her she would not be successfully a male until she could pee standing up, and she has passed away due to the infections caused by it. And it's just, it's really, really tragic.
It's
and so
horrible.
those folks on the left who have a very huge moral sense of care foundation is what The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt calls this in moral psychology. I know they deeply care, and and the saddest part is that their own morals have been weaponized against them. And I can't imagine the moral injury that so many folks are waking up. If they wake up from the fact that they've been radicalized into this and then realize that the moral injury of that is very deep. And so as someone who's been in a cult, I understand, because not only was I impacted, but then I perpetrated and injured others by it. And it just gets wicked and painful and dark. And so I just really appreciate the work that you're doing, and, listeners, to be able to find Martha and her whole posse. The links in the show notes. And again, thank you for your time. We will be staying in touch with seeing what you guys are up to. And thanks for, again, spending time with us this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Megan.
That's all I have for you today, folks. Thanks again for listening. And if you've yet to leave a 5-star review, I would love it if you could take the time to do so. That helps get this podcast out to more listeners. Please share it with a friend, or I'd love to hear from you. Do you have some feedback? What do you think? And until next time, stay curious, embrace skepticism, and keep tuning in. Have a great week.